Well, good evening, welcome. Welcome to this seminar on CVE and PVE policies from a comparative and global perspective. More than 155,000 people have died victims of terrorist attacks in the 21st century. Just 4% of these victims are in Western countries. Yet, as you all know, terrorism is among European citizens' main concerns. The chances of dying in a terrorist attack are almost zero, but the fear of terrorism is growing. The attacks in Madrid, London, Oslo, Paris, Brussels, Nice, Berlin, Manchester, and Barcelona, among others, have only increased this sense of fear and insecurity. Richard English, in his essential book, Terrorism, How to Respond, says that the threat terrorism poses to democracy is not the risk of death and destruction, which is always limited, particularly limited if we compare it with a war, but the real danger is what it provokes, the danger of provoking regrettable and counterproductive responses from states. In many European countries, the experience of a terrorist attack has led to the declaration of war against an external enemy, but also very often as well, war against the enemy within. For example, declaring a state of emergency and deploying the army in the streets of major cities. In response to terrorist attacks, administrations at different levels, but particularly at the national level, have developed policies for detection and for prevention. It all began as a rhetorical commitment by certain international agencies and also national governments. But nowadays, it has become a set of policies and programs that have been developing around the world, and at the end, though they are different and may differ substantially, at the end they apply similar terms such as terrorism, radicalization, violent extremism, and most of these policies and programs combine measures that clearly focus on security with others that aim to prevent violent extremism. When referring to countering violent extremism, CVE, and preventing violent extremism, PVE, are we talking about the same? Do these paradigms differ substantially? Should we distinguish both concepts? Which CVE and which PVE strategies are appropriate under what conditions? How are these policies and these programs implemented by governmental and non-governmental actors, and what could or should be done? These are the questions that led us to organize this seminar, and to answer all these questions or to discuss all these questions, we have the pleasure to have with us Christian Leuprecht from Canada and Moussa Bourekba, who is, as you all know, our researcher here at CIDOB on all these issues. Let me introduce them directly, very briefly. Christian Leuprecht is Professor of Political Science at the Royal Military College of Canada and a Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He has worked on anti-terrorism, national security, and international affairs on a wide range of issues, from police services, organized crime, and the NATO, to policies to counter terrorism, and with a particular focus, if I'm not wrong, on counter-narratives. And all these from a comparative perspective. Moussa Bourekba is, as you know, researcher here at CIDOB. He's also lecturer on international relations at Ramon Llull University here in Barcelona. He has worked for several years in a project analyzing youth conditions and expectations in the southern and eastern Mediterranean region. And in recent years, he has focused on processes of radicalization, violent extremism in Europe, but also in North Africa, and Islam in Western countries. I'll be moderating the discussion, so I'll pose questions, and after an hour we will open the floor for discussion. Moussa, what do we mean by countering violent extremism, CVE, and preventing violent extremism, PVE? Are these different paradigms, as I said before? How did we move from one to the other?
Thank you. Thank you, Blanca. Hola a todas y a todos. We'll try to answer to your question. I mean, the last part I think is the easiest one, but basically I will try to give you background to better understand those concepts. And please, Christian, if you disagree with what I'm going to say, just take some notes so that we can have some debates. So basically after the 9/11, when we refer to CVE and PVE, we refer to two recent developments in the field of counterterrorism. As you may know, after the 9/11, George W. Bush declared the global war on terrorism, and the idea was to focus on military force in order to destroy Al-Qaeda. In 2005, the administration decided to revise their own strategy, and basically they decided to opt for CVE rather than counterterrorism, or better said, to add CVE as a component of counterterrorism policies. Why did they do so? The first reason was that none of the objectives set by the global war on terrorism was reached. I mean, Al-Qaeda was not destroyed, their leaders were not neutralized. The second reason is that the concept of war on terror was much criticized for what it meant in terms of human rights violations, the US invasion in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So they decided they proposed violent extremism as a substitute to the controverted concept of terrorism. And finally, if you do remember, in 2005 in Europe we had the terrorist attacks in London, and 1 year earlier there was the terrorist attacks of Madrid, the 11M. So the states were faced somehow with a new threat, which had to do with homegrown terrorism. So basically between 2005 and 2011, I would say, but this is something that we can definitely discuss, many countries adopted CVE strategies. At the EU level, the EU counterterrorism strategy adopted had 4 pillars: prevent, protect, respond, and pursue. And the prevent strand was meant to address the conditions that push people towards radicalization into violent extremism. The UK government included prevent as part of its broader counterterrorism strategy, and so on and so forth. And basically, what does CVE mean in practice? The use of CVE means, it reflects the idea that you cannot fight terrorist organizations only by military means, but that basically you need to look at, or you need to address all those factors and conditions that push people towards violent extremism. So this is the moment where we talk, and when you look at official documents and research, everybody starts talking about root causes of terrorism. And this is basically under the whole CVE pillar. So now talking about PVE, preventing violent extremism, it's actually quite hard to trace back the origins of the terms, and maybe Christian, you may help with this. And I think it's difficult for one main reason. The reason is that many programs that were CVE programs or strategies were labeled as preventive programs or strategies. Think about prevent. Think about France's plans to prevent radicalization. If you look at the content of these policies and strategies, the main priority back then was not really to prevent people from joining groups, but rather to spot or to detect those people who are undergoing a process of radicalization. So I would say that more recently, the concept of PVE emerged in policy cycles, especially after 2014, and I would say maybe from 2015 onwards, for two main reasons, and that's my opinion. Maybe Christian, you may have another perspective on that, but I think it's deeply linked with the existence of the Islamic State organization, of other organizations such as Ansar al-Sharia, who are gaining control of some territories, some areas of failed governance, and the associated phenomenon of foreign fighters. Remember that between 2013 and 2016, about 40,000 people from 100 countries left their countries to join ISIS and other groups in Syria and Iraq. And I think back then, for policymakers, there were three main questions. Why do hundreds or thousands of people leave their countries to join a terrorist organization? That was the first one. How can we prevent more individuals from joining these groups? And finally, that was a more recent question, how can we deal with people returning from Syria, Iraq, Libya, Mali, and other conflicting zones, given the risk that they may pose for national security? And this risk became real because, as you may know, in November 2015, the terrorist attack against the Bataclan, you had some people who were returning foreign fighters. So basically this is, in 2015, PVE becomes somehow officially recognized. There is a plan that is adopted by the United Nations, the United Nations Action Plan to Prevent Violent Extremism. So I would say that the aim of PVE, and this is something that I think also the aim of this conference is to try to define it well, is to involve all the actors in order to properly deal and address the factors conducive to violent extremism, which means not only security bodies, but also teachers, mayors, religious leaders, grassroots communities, civil society organizations, and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, I would say that CVE is about countering existing threats, while PVE is about preventing the threat from materializing.
Mm-hmm. Christian, I would like to ask you about the radicalization processes, but maybe before you would like to respond to what Moussa said, or let's jump directly to the reasons behind radicalization and how these link with prevention and PVE policies.
So look, thanks. Thank you for the very kind invitation, and thanks for having me here. Thanks to Lorraine from the embassy for also helping to make this possible, and for some wonderful friends who are joining us, longtime friends, and for having me back here. It's a timely day to talk about this, because if you followed the news, there's a meeting in Paris, what the media have called the Christchurch Call, where leaders are pledging that they will do more to remove violent content from the internet, and there's a bunch of the executives from the big tech companies there who are pledging to be more cooperative. I've heard it on a couple of interviews today that I'm quite skeptical about this whole effort, and I think that relates to what we're talking about today. So this is to say that it's a very challenging environment, and I think part of what we can take away from Moussa's very helpful, I think, overview of this is that policymakers really struggle with there's a big expectation by the public to do something, and policymakers struggle with what to do. And if you want to sum up sort of the way that I've approached this, is that I think much of what we do rests on a fundamental confusion of two distinct problems. And I think this is what Moussa was also trying to get at the difference between sort of preventing violent extremism and countering extremist violence. And this distinction is absolutely key here. So why would you travel to Paris and make a big pledge to take things down from the internet and objectionable content and whatnot? Because fundamentally, there's a belief, and I think we've had this belief for a long time, that what people view on the internet is going to influence how they think about the world. And so if they view objectionable content, then that's somehow going to make them violent or make them more likely to become violent. And I've long had serious concerns about this. Now, as a simple sort of way to think about this, that there's of course lots of violent content on extremist violent content ideologically on the internet, but very few people actually become violent. And so that in itself should give us a hint that this is a very complex problem, multivariate problem, as social scientists like to call these things. And so what bedevils us is trying to disentangle these connections. And I think there's basically three different ways that we can look at these connections. One is that there's sort of there's a broad structure of opinions in the population, and these vary. And somehow these sort of combine, and then some people become violent. And so that's sort of the intelligence law enforcement view. Then we just kind of need to make sure we catch people when they cross that line into violence. The second category is a view that says, okay, there's a big structure and variation of opinion, but there's certain specific, what keeps people from becoming violent is the cost involved in violence. So there's a psychological cost. So if you think of it as human nature, it's actually very hard to kill other human beings. So people need to justify and rationalize the killing. But there's also an economic cost, right? So there's the cost that either you die or you're going to get arrested and go to jail for a very long time. And in that sense, I think this is part of how we've structured much of the legislation in this space. And I'd actually say that we've been quite successful at this, and I think this is a key sort of element here. And the third is a view that there are very specific patterns of opinion combined with other contextual factors that put people at very high risk of engaging in violence. And this is sort of what much of the prevention space works in, which is very much a local sort of effort to try to identify those individuals where we believe that they have a combination of beliefs and of high risk other behavioral patterns. Many of them come from standard paradigms of criminology that we've known about for decades, of what puts people at high risk of getting into trouble with the criminal justice system. And so then we want to identify these people early on. The confusion here lies in using one policy tool to address what are fundamentally two different problems. So one is the problem of violent extremism, which is an ideological problem. And often violent extremism is linked to what is known as mass radicalization. So as to say, certain sub-communities where entire communities sympathize with a particular point of view. And there's some evidence that there are some places in Europe where that may be a bit of a challenge. So if you think of Molenbeek, if you think of some of the issues around Bradford, for instance, certain sort of banlieue in France. But it's a problem that's isolated in particular to certain subsets of communities. It is not a broad-based societal problem. And so we believe that we can counter it. The other is the problem of violence. And so an extremist violence in particular. And I think the challenge on the violence is that to turn the question around is, why are so few people violent? So we know that there's a reasonably large group of people who sympathize with these ideas. And as a result, some of them become activists, so they engage in political activity, but it's perfectly legal political activity. Some of them engage in activity that is illegal, but it is not violent. These are people we commonly call radicals. And some of them engage in activity that is illegal and violent, or intended to incite other people to engage in violence. And those are the people we commonly call terrorists. And so that then raises the question about how do people move? How do people end up in one of these categories? And it turns out that that's very individualized and very complex. And that aside from the context of some communities that I sort of mentioned, there's not a whole lot of good evidence exactly what drives some individuals. So if you think about, so I was in San Diego when the synagogue was attacked by the lone actor in San Diego. And so here's a kid who, by all accounts, became violent very quickly. Whereas other people engage in this milieu and this space for a very long period of time and never do anything. Some might become activists, some might become radicals, for instance, by donating to a cause that's illegal. But very few people actually become terrorists. And so, and then we need to distinguish on the violence side between the kid in San Diego, so the lone actor phenomenon, because this is a real problem for intelligence and law enforcement. Because these people tend to look very much like society until the very last moment when they're looking to move from thought to action, right? So he purchased his weapons, 24 hours or something like that before the attack. So only at that point do you know that here's a kid who might have been watching a bunch of material online, but who's now obviously has an intent to engage in violence. It's easier on the group side, as we, for instance, know with Sri Lanka, where we know that there were advanced warnings and what may or may not have gone wrong in terms of actually heeding those warnings. But again, so one is protecting society from the individuals, from the lone actors. The other is protecting society from, and the lone actors are their problem, as we know from Christchurch, but it's a challenge very different from the sort of attacks that we saw in Paris or we saw in Sri Lanka, where we have networks of individuals, often who've been trained, who know how to run surveillance, who know how to organize themselves, and are able to cause systematic carnage on a very large scale. And I think what motivates them is also quite different. Enough for now, but...
Thanks, I'll come back to this. But Moussa, would you also distinguish between violent extremism and violence, or this extremist violence, as he said, and link to this, what is the link between ideas, ideologies, and action? And I'll come back to you with the same question later.
So, basically, the challenge that we have is more or less the same that we had with the term terrorism. When it comes to define what is violent extremism, we would define it as the use of violence for political, ideological, or social goals. Now, with what Christian was saying, I mean, the role of ideology in the process of radicalization, it does play a role in many cases. For many reasons, ideology is what will connect your grievances. The ideology will tell you why, as an individual living in Ripoll, you are suffering from racism or exclusion or discrimination. Ideology is what will connect this individual grievance to a broader framework. You are suffering this at your individual level because at a global level you have a war between the West and Islam. Ideology is what helps you to put the blame for it to somebody, the West, the Jews, the government, and so on and so forth. And finally, ideology is also what will offer you the solution and justify the use of violence. Now, interestingly, there is nothing. I mean, in terms of research, we did not evidence that there was a link between ideology and acting in a violent way. This may happen in some cases, and in other cases, not. And I think, I mean, in the chapter that you're going to publish, Christian, there are the Clark Macaulay and Sofia Moskalenko, who are two authors famous for the pyramid model of radicalization. And basically, on the basis of their research, if you, yes, and here it's properly called the opinion pyramid. So on the basis of their research, they have found that most of those who hold radical ideas do not act violently, while many people who act with violence do not necessarily hold radical views. As Olivier Roy would say, most terrorists are radicals, but most radicals are not terrorists. And this is a big problem for public policies. If you do not have a direct and automatic link, how can you act to prevent violent extremism? So now, interestingly, if you look at what is being done in practice, and this is something that we have seen in a study that jointly with Blanca we carried out last year on PVE policies in different European cities, despite of the fact that we do not have evidence of this link between radical views and radical behavior, many programs, PVE programs that were implemented, do assume that there is a direct link. And you have a few examples. It was, I think, in 2009, a scholar, Arun Kundnani in the UK, he showed that the PREVENT program was designed on the basis of demographic indicators, meaning that to know how much money they should allocate to each city, they were looking at how many Muslims were living in Birmingham, Liverpool, and so on. So the number of Muslims would give you an indication of the threat. Another example, and this happened actually in Spain, right after the terrorist attack of August 2 years ago, the Spanish government, but also France did the same. One of the first measures they have said was to ask Morocco to send them imams in order to promote a moderate view of Islam among Muslim citizens. So the underlying thinking was that the less rigorist is a Muslim, the less prone to radicalization. And basically, some countries understood it. Morocco took this opportunity to say, hey, we are actually working on moderating our fellows, and we can send imams to Senegal, to Tunisia, to France, to Germany, to anywhere you want. And finally, you have another obvious example, which is the indicators of radicalization used in Germany, in the UK, in France, in Spain, and so on and so forth. And those indicators, they were often based on the Islamic practice or appearances. If he grows the beard, if she wears the hijab from a day to another, she's at risk, basically. So ideology does play a role, of course, but you do not have the direct link between adopting a radical ideology or view and radical behavior.
Thank you, Moussa. Christian, I come back to you with the same question. How do you see the link between ideas, ideologies, and action? And going a little bit further, how the way this link is perceived informs or shapes PVE policies?
So I'll pick up on a nice point that Moussa just made, that there's sort of this assumption by policymakers, especially if you talk to people in capital cities, that if you have large groups of people or communities that hold radical views, they don't like us, whether that's Canada or the West or democracy or so, because they are radical. So if we can make them less radical, then they like us more. And it turns out, when you do survey research, the two are independent of one another. People can perfectly love liking Spanish democracy, and they can hold extremely radical views both at the same time. And so this is sort of my point about that. We live in a democracy, right? We elect governments. Governments invest in all sorts of crazy public policies all the time. Whether these policies do anything or work, that's why we can vote for people and we have a choice. But we can show pretty clearly that trying to make communities less radical isn't going to do anything more or less about how they feel about living in our country. So the question is then, is that something we should be investing money in? Because in my view, it doesn't do a whole lot. And I always get a little concerned when democratic governments get involved in what people think. I always think we should stick to the sort of activities that are actually criminal, or where we have lots of very good indicators that people are actually likely to engage in criminal activity. But here's why, I always say, like, anybody who's been in a relationship will know that what people think or believe or say isn't a good predictor of what they're going to do. We have 50 years of psychological research on that. So even if they don't just think something, even if they engage in bravado, we know that very few of the people who engage in bravado actually become violent. And to the contrary, the people who actually become violent usually deliberately fly under the radar, so they're not going out and making a whole lot of fuss about what it is that they believe. But here's why the ideology is important and why the conversation about the ideology is important. The assumption is that it is the ideology that drives the violence. And I think while that might possibly be the case in a very small number of cases, for a whole number of reasons we don't need to discuss here, it would be impossible to design a robust research methodology to actually test this hypothesis. But what I do think the ideology does, it acts like a language, right? So I'm currently spending a bit of time in Rome, so I'm trying to learn a little bit of Italian or so. And you can try to learn a language before you go somewhere, but if you're learning Catalan, it won't make a whole lot of sense until you have a chance to come to Barcelona and you have a chance to talk to Moussa and to Blanca and to friends, and you enjoy the wonderful foods. And so you need a context. And I think that's what the ideology does. It's like learning a language. It gives you a context for the actions. And why is that context important? Because the context allows you to justify and rationalize violent activity that I think in many cases you, for whatever reason, had already decided you were going to engage in. But it allows you to overcome those costs that I talked about, those inhibitions, either the legal inhibitions of getting arrested or of dying, or the inhibitions psychologically of killing another person. And how does it do that? Well, it's allow me to indulge you just for a moment because I always think this is really fun. I just need to find the slide here. Hang on. So think about how the ideology works. Right? So first, there's an idea at the root of the ideology. Right? So if you look at the videos, you look at the propaganda, it all follows the same script. There's a standard script to it all. So Islam is under attack. That's the basic idea behind it. Then there's a narrative, right? That jihadis are the defender of Islam. Then there's the ideology that the defense of Islam is appropriate, it's proportional, it's just, it's sanctified, and you have the authority to defend Islam. And then there's the identity, the sense of the moral duty, that you need to do something, you need to become involved. And if you are a true believer, then you need to become involved. But if you look at that narrative, it's not particular to violent extremism. This is the same narrative that Western countries use to make citizens. It's the same narrative that Vladimir Putin uses to get Russians to buy into his particular view of, the West is all against us, and the West is unjust, and the rule of law is all unjust and biased against us. So it's a well-honed script. So in some ways, it's just capitalizing on the same sort of ideas that our states have long told us what we're about, only that, of course, our states no longer advocate violence. This is a country that knows lots about political violence and making citizens with political violence. And I think within those narratives, there are 4 subsets. So this is where we get the difference in terms of the ideology, and I think where the ideology acts differently on different people. So one is sort of the political subset there's sort of the Western hegemony, or democracy is bad, or globalization that exploits people or whatnot. Then there's the moral narrative that the West is all, Western morals are all bad, and there's moral decay, and so this is sort of upholding sort of the better life, sort of the appeal to the ethics of life. Then there's sort of the religious narrative, where it becomes a legitimation of yourself in terms of identifying with that particular interpretation of religion, and it becomes a way of identifying religion as a legitimate instrument to engage in violence. And the fourth is sort of the socio-psychological narrative. This is sort of the standard sort of solipsistic narrative of there's an in-group and there's an out-group. And so if you're to be part of the in-group, here's all the things you have to believe in, and here's all the things you have to do. And here's where I think this works particularly well. Hang on, I just need to find right. So I think there's 2 types of people that are particularly attracted to this type of ideology. One are the people who are the disconnected, disordered types. So those are the people who just have trouble in life. They have trouble connecting with folks or with society. They have been particularly sort of hard hit in life. They can't hold down a job. They might have some mental issues, mental health issues, whatnot. So I think that's the one type of person to which this is particularly appealing. But the other, and you're all familiar with this, and we know that about 1/3 of lone actor terrorists fall into this category. But the other, and we always forget about the other, is what I call, and what Rick and I call like the caring, compelled people. They're just really affected by something that they see. They just have this incredible sort of emotional response to things that they see that they believe are unfair or unjust. And so they feel particularly, because they care so much, they feel particularly compelled to do something. And so I use this just to reinforce, I think, the point that there are certain individuals that have certain attitudinal traits that make them particularly prone to engaging in violence, and with whom the ideological narrative has particular attraction. But it is not the narrative per se that causes the violence. It is the narrative that allows them to rationalize violence that they had already decided to engage in, but they needed a way of overcoming the barriers, the costs of becoming violent.
Thanks, Christian. Let me insist in this point, particularly on the role of ideologies. You said, or you referred to the risk of liberal democracies getting involved in what people think. But at the same time, in your recent publication, in this chapter you are referring to, you refer to the war of ideas against the global jihadist narrative. How does this war of ideas, or what you also call these counter-narratives, look like, or should look like, and what are the main difficulties, challenges, limits of these counter-narratives? And then I'll go back to Moussa to respond to the same question, but also taking into account the French case. You are a specialist on the French case, and as far as I know, PVE policies or CVE policies in France put this war against ideas at the center of its strategy. And all these questions, quite briefly, because we don't have much time, and we would like as well to have time for the debate with the audience.
So there's two targets for the counter-narratives, and they're two different counter-narratives. One is sort of the war of ideas, right? So there's a cultural struggle, right, about sort of who has the better epistemics, community epistemic worldview, the better sort of ethics. And so there's an opportunity, I think, on the mass level, not the individual level, on the mass level to engage with communities, I think, at least to perhaps reduce some of the radical views that they hold. As I say, but we need to do this independently from somehow making them better citizens or so. I think we can sort of reduce some of the level of radicalization, if you want, in that opinion, and mitigate that in that opinion pyramid. But then there's the counter-narratives for the individuals who are at particularly high risk. And I think that's where, for instance, the Danes do an interesting job. There's, in Canada, the hub models, where you identify high-risk individuals, and you have to sort of talk them down from the ledge, sort of, it's like somebody who's about to jump. You have to talk them down from the ledge, but at the same time, you have to provide them with a whole bunch of other supports to allow them to make them more functional human beings. But because a lot of this is still driven by how people view the world, I've never been sure about the extent to which we can actually change people's worldviews. And so I think this is sort of my reticence that I have about getting too involved with the ideas, but we can always talk people back from the ledge, and that's, I think, the counter-narrative opportunity. But look, so how do we, but let's just assume, so let's assume that, for instance, all this violent content on the internet is driving the violence. Even if we assume that, what are we going to do about it? So if any of you watched the testimony by Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress, he didn't show up as a CEO of one of the largest companies in the world. If you look at the way he behaved, the way he conducted himself, and the way he talked, he behaved like the leader of essentially a sovereign entity. He made it very clear that Facebook will do whatever it thinks it wants, can, or needs to do. And pull up the testimony on the web, because the one senator who understood what was going on was Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey Graham makes this point about, we ought to pass a law to keep you in line. So I think if we're hoping that we're going to get these private companies to remove content, that's a cost for them, and they thrive on sensationalism. How can we get them to comply? If we look at the German model, so Germany's passed there's significant fines in Germany for not removing content that is prohibited, that Germany has deemed as prohibited content. And so what the companies have done, I think quite intentionally, to undermine the German effort on fines, they're taking off huge portions of content that could possibly in any way infringe on the German law. They say it's because they have to be careful because they don't want to get fined. I think it's because they want to send a message to everyone else, don't pass laws on content, because you're going to get such pushback from people, because so much stuff is going to disappear, that you're going to have to amend the law. So we'll see it'll be very interesting to watch. But as you can see, I'm not. So even if we assume that somehow stuff on the web was driving the violence, I'm not sure how much we could actually do about containing it. The other comparison is, of course, countries such as France that have long filtered content. The UK also does this to some extent. But so arguably, but Canada doesn't filter ideological, extremist, violent content. So arguably, people in Canada and France can see the same material. You could argue that people in Canada can actually see worse material than people in France. And yet in France, you have 25,000 people on the fichier, about half of whom are considered seriously high risk. And in Canada, we have about 200. I think 273 is the last public figure. So again, I'm not sure that this is really sort of the main target for us to focus on. So I think there's targeted opportunities for counter-narratives for very particular individuals, or possibly to engage with communities, but not on the grounds of violence.
Moussa, what is your analysis on this war of ideas or these counter-narratives, particularly taking into account the case of France?
I would say that I'm not very much optimistic about. I mean, anytime in the international relations or in policy cycles, anytime you have a new concept that comes up, I never trust this actually. So we talk about resilience, so you know that there is something problematic behind it, and the whole counter-narrative bubble, which started actually in 2014, when the campaign started against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. You had this "Not in My Name" campaign in the UK. I don't know if you do remember. Muslims saying "Not in my name, I'm Muslim but I'm not a terrorist," and so on. But basically, no, I'm not that much optimistic for two or three reasons. The first one is, when you talk about countering narrative, when you counter something, it means that you are late, that something is already happening, and somehow you need to run after what is happening to try to fix it. And basically, if you look at the campaigns, and that was the case of France, those campaigns were, in essence, they were reactive. So what they were trying to say was how bad is the Islamic State, or how bad is terrorism, and so on and so forth. The campaign that was launched in France in 2015, Stop Jihadism, I mean, it became ridiculous to such a point that many humorists were making spectacles and uploading videos, because the whole video was somehow shocking and saying the Islamic State is promising you heaven, but actually you will find out that there is hell. And they were taking some myth from ISIS and trying to counter them. And basically, when you focus on the ideological factors, I mean, this to me showed to which extent policymakers overlook non-ideological factors of radicalization. So everything happens as if it was ideology itself which drove somebody in the hands of violent extremist groups. And we're talking about internet. You may have the content available online on internet, but people, I mean, something should happen so that an individual goes and becomes interested to find the content. So you can censor it, you can block it, you always have the dark net, and I think it's much better to have it available online so that maybe you can monitor the people than leaving it at the margins of internet and not having a control. Another problem that I see with counter-narratives is basically credibility. Most of the actors that were campaigning or founding these campaigns, you found the French government, you found some religious institutions such as Al-Azhar in Cairo, Egypt, which is an influential Islamic institutions. Most actors are official actors. But what happens if you undergo a process of radicalization? Those same actors, according to you, are part of a bigger conspiracy. So the last thing that you may do is believing in what they are saying. So you had other strategies that consisted in founding civil society organizations and so on, but hiding like this public founding. And the UK was doing it a lot with many controversies. So in the end, I think it's more about understanding first what drives somebody in the hands of violent extremist groups, beyond ideology. Ideology is there, okay, but what is beyond? And basically offering an alternative to those people. And I think that rather than sending this kind of boring, generic, rational messages of this is good and bad, you should play on emotions too. What about theater plays? What about a testimony from a victim of terrorism? What about humor? Using humor, and I think all those means that can help to sow the seed of doubt in the mind of people. I mean, to me, the most important, if you want to provoke a change or a cognitive opening, is just to make somebody doubt. He's so sure when he undergoes the process of radicalization, so that if he starts doubting, I mean, you did half of the job. And this is why, I mean, Scott Atran was saying, let's stop talking about counter-narrative, let's talk about alternative narratives. And I think this is what we should do, like providing an alternative. But if you want to do so, you have to understand first that ideology is not necessarily the key driver, that there are other grievances, socioeconomic, psychological, and that a terrorist organization is not only promising its candidates to be hid on the name of God. They can provide you a job, they can provide you a status, they can make you become somebody while you're anybody in society.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I have one last question, but I'll keep it. Let's now open the floor for discussion, for comments, for questions, and then I'll go back to my question. Sí, podéis hablar en catalán o en castellano. Y por favor, si os podéis presentar brevemente al principio. Gracias.
Gracias. Puedo hablar en español, pero no
Sí.
sé si todo el mundo entiende. Sí.
We will translate it to him. Uh-huh.
Puedo hablar en inglés también, lo mismo. Bueno, hablo en inglés así no
Lo que te sea más fácil, lo que quieras.
Tiempo en traducción. My name is Celia Milesi. I'm on holidays in Barcelona. Until April this year, I was a senior advisor on peace and development at the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation in New York. So, holidays not working. I'm coming to a very interesting seminar. So, I have a couple of comments. I feel very uncomfortable, to be honest, with the presentation, and I just want you to help me to understand why, when you talk about preventing violent extremism or violent extremism, you have only what it seems to be a very individualistic behavioral approach in which you only discuss about people's decisions, minds, or reactions to media platforms, etc. So I think the sustaining peace agenda, and I'm not sure how much of the counterterrorism agenda is connecting with the sustaining peace agenda, is more looking at the systemic root causes that Moussa mentioned briefly in the beginning of the presentation. And I'm just wondering, in that sense, how do you see the European governments can change specific policies towards minorities or certain religious groups or certain political groups so you can prevent violent extremism in Europe? Because as you said, Blanca, you are very concerned, but none of you have discussed how Europe and its decision within Europe and outside Europe are creating this violence, not only at the military level, but also at the educational policies, human rights policies. Now, for example, the European Peace Facility has been, I think, discussed yesterday, and it's all about a military approach from Europe, within Europe and to the world in order to prevent violent extremism. So I would like to hear why is that so based in ideas and ideology and in an approach with a kind of very limited lens of individualistic problem or religious problem. And I would like to hear what do you propose Europe can do. You, as a Europeans, have control of your own policies, so I guess you have some concrete ideas on that.
So can you clarify, you talked about the military approach, a militarized approach. Can you just clarify what you mean by that?
To be honest, basically what you just mentioned, intervention in Iraq, intervention in Libya, financing the armed struggle in Yemen, and you name it, all the Middle East countries, Mediterranean countries, where basically European countries, NATO and the US are financing different armed groups. and creating the grievances that you mentioned briefly in some of the presentations. Internally, I don't know so much about the European Peace Facility because I think it was just discussed yesterday, but maybe you know. But at least 12 civil society organizations from whole Europe came together to say that obviously a militaristic approach to countering violent extremism is not enough. And sorry, the last comment I just remember. Why also you divide this type of extremism or violent extremism to another violent phenomenon, like you may have here in Spain until very recently with ETA, or now in Northern Ireland in Europe, or right-wing extremist groups within Europe, or other violent groups, and you only talk about Muslims groups in particular. So I would like to understand why you analyze terrorism, which is such a very limited angle, in my view, no?
Well, we have already 3 questions, so let's start with these 3 big questions, and then we have a second round of comments and questions. Who wants to start?
So I think you make many very valuable points. So I'd also be happy for us to chat afterwards. So I sympathize and in some ways concur with many of the remarks you make. But I think we're talking about 2 different things here. And so this is sort of, so first, okay, so when we talk about terrorism, I think we need to distinguish between 3 different types of terrorism, right? So there's nationalist type of terrorism, ETA, IRA, whatever, Front National Liberation Corps, whatnot. There's international terrorism, by which we understand state-sponsored terrorism. North Korea, Iran, the countries that make it on the list regularly. And then there's the phenomenon of transnational terrorism. And so I think these have different drivers, and so we clearly need to use different mechanisms to deter them, contain them, disrupt them. And I think on the transnational side, I take your criticism, I think, which is reasonably well directed, but the change of that, the one form of violent extremism that we have paid a lot of attention to is in particularly sort of the Salafist, jihadi-driven extremism. I think the one positive thing that's come out of Christchurch and out of the meeting in Paris, as a silver lining of the terrible events in Christchurch, is the cognizance that we treated Islamist-inspired extremism as a global phenomenon, but we treated right-wing violent extremism as sort of a localized phenomenon. It's local militias, or it's people in the US South, or whatever it might be. And I think we've only since Christchurch really had the recognition, the intelligence services have been on to this since Breivik, but publicly the recognition that this is as much of a global phenomenon. And the data that came out in Germany yesterday or 2 days ago, that showed that 85%, so of the 35,000 violent extremist incidents in Germany last year, 85% were committed by people on the right wing. So it's a significant challenge and but we've not treated it as a transnational phenomenon. So I think I think there's a shift here. When you talk about systemic root causes, I always get a little concerned because the assumption behind this is sort of the neo-Marxist assumption that there's sort of in-groups, out-groups, and there's sort of a hegemon, or there's people who are exploited and people who are discriminated against, and it's sort of the assumption that people become violent because they don't have jobs, or because they live in ghettos, or they go to schools that are terrible schools, or whatever it might be. All these things are terrible things that we should all fix in a democracy. I totally concur with you. But there's no evidence that they're actually driving the violence. That if poverty was driving the violence, we would see a lot more violence than we do. And poverty drives certain types of collective violence. But I think we shouldn't confound, and I think like this is, Michel Viviorca and other people have made this point, that we got to be careful about not confounding different types of violence. People who are violent because of the circumstances in which they live and who are expressing their protests on the streets, as they are in the banlieue of France or in the suburbs of Stockholm, should not be confounded with people who are engaging in violence for Salafist jihadi reasons, because we will use the wrong policy response and we turn everybody into terrorists. And I think we need to keep that label of terrorists for the very small group of people who are engaging it for very strict, very specific political purposes. Because we don't want to demonize the people who are complaining about the terrible circumstances in which they live. And as you say, where we should be doing a lot more on social policy and whatnot. At the same time, if our objective is to counter terrorism and is to reduce the risk of terrorism, we always need to ask, there's lots of demands on our public, on the public dollar, on the public purse, and on public money. So we always need to ask whether what we're putting our money into, whether that's actually going to achieve the objective. There's lots of good reasons to make people better off, put more money into schools, put more money into housing, redistributive policies, whatnot. But if we're trying to reduce the risk of transnational terrorism, there is no good evidence to suggest that putting our public money into those policies will actually reduce the risk of transnational terrorism, at least in Western societies. I think the conversation is different if you talk about the Middle East, where we've had a bunch of kleptocrats robbing their countries blind. And of course the ISIS phenomenon is driven by economic, religious, ethnic, political injustices and asymmetries that are very profound. So, okay. And I'm happy for you to push back on any of these. Then people talk about Europe. I think talking about Europe makes about as much sense as talking about America. There's no such thing as Europe. They are very different countries that have very different outcomes. The problem manifests itself very differently in a country like Germany, that I know quite well, also at the meso and micro level, relative to a country like Belgium or France, or Spain for that matter, which I don't know all that particularly well. So I think we got to be careful about kind of throwing everything into sort of that there's a European approach. Yeah, I think we coordinate at the European level, but it's a highly localized phenomenon, even within countries. We were talking before about, look at France, where you have a very high concentration of high-risk individuals in Paris and in Nice, in particular. And there's very interesting local explanations for why that is that we don't need to get into. But even talking about country level doesn't make a lot of sense. If we talk about the UK, the real challenges are with a particular subset of population in Bradford that has its roots in sort of the Stan sort of regions of Pakistan that came with relatively low skill sets, low language capabilities, hold extremely conservative views, and that have had a disproportionate struggle at gaining a meaningful foothold in UK society. So it's not a UK problem, it's not an immigrant problem, it's not an ethnic group problem. So I think let's keep our eye on the ball if we're talking about terrorism, and let's focus on those particular groups where we know we have a particular challenge. I'll have a very quick sort of on the militarized response. Okay, so I think it's, So look, I think we make things a security or military problem when we don't know what to do about something, right? So it's why did Hungary call out the military when they had the migrants come through Budapest? Because there was no capacity to respond. There was no civil service capacity, there was no social work capacity, there was no other way to respond. So they call out the military. What we have, I was not a fan of bombing Libya. I think anybody I've lived in the Middle East for 5 years, so anybody who knows knew that this wasn't going to go well. But now that we have essentially a quasi-failed state in Libya, what's the best that we can do? Essentially, what the European Union is doing is buying a bunch of militias that are essentially serving as the quasi-front line of the European border patrol to try to push migrants back. We can have all sorts of debates about the morality of that and what's proportionate. But if there is a political democratic will in Europe by voters that they say, look, we want governments to do something. I think in Libya currently it's the only option. There are other models. So the European Union, in terms of its neighborhood policy, actually engages very differently with different countries. So does, of course, the UN through CTED, through the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and through the CTITF, that you'll also be quite familiar with probably, where we take very different capacity building approaches to different countries. Lebanon, the European Union has essentially a capacity building approach that has actually worked quite closely with the Hezbollah militia, because it has made the Hezbollah militia, actually, when it comes to border sort of issues, a trusted actor for all the people in Lebanon, not just for people who sympathize with the Hezbollah. We don't need to go, so we can talk more in detail. But I think different state contexts require us to respond in different ways. And if we don't like Libya, okay, but what's the alternative? So.
Let's take other questions, comments, and then I'll give the floor to Moussa to respond to these last questions, but also to the first three ones.
Thank you. My name is Camila. I just arrived in Spain as well. I used to work at Harvard Center for International Development until last month. So my question is, you mentioned at the beginning that only 4% of all deaths from terrorism happen in the West. And so there seems to be a huge response and a lot of efforts and money and so on counterterrorism approaches. Does that make sense then, or is it because as you mentioned, we could be spending that money on health policies, education policies that could maybe possibly be saving a lot more lives? So does it make sense really, or is it more a political approach and governments saying, yes, we are doing something about it? Or is the West not affected so much precisely because there have been different policies to tackle terrorism, if that makes sense? Mm-hmm. So I mean, what would happen if we said, okay, this is not actually that big of a problem, we will take that money and put on like health programs or so on?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other comments, questions?
Moussa, do you want to
In
start?
all possible languages. Otherwise, I'll pose a question, my last question, in fact. Having said all you said, taking into account all you said, what could be done in terms of PVE, CVE policies to not fall into the pitfalls of current PVE and CVE policies? In all these limitations, challenges, limits, problems, what can we do to improve the state response and administration response to this phenomena that, as you said, goes far beyond the jihadist violent extremism, also vis-a-vis extreme right extremism, which in Europe I think that is the biggest form of violent extremism. Moussa, but please feel free to respond as well to the first questions.
Yeah, I think I would jump to the question you have made, although I think Christian has some nice lines written about this specific question actually in your chapter. I do remember it. But basically, if you convince a political leader who, I mean, if you have a terrorist attack in one country that killed, put 17 people, not even 200 or 500 like in Somalia, if you manage to convince a political leader that he or she should not do anything after that, I mean, if you give me the recipe for it, I will follow you. Then, I mean, I'm not going to answer to that question precisely because I think, I mean, Christian wrote something precisely on that issue, and he will be able to give you a proper answer. Now, on what you were asking, Blanca, as we were commenting just before the conference, when you are asked to deliver a training on PVE to some public administration or to civil society organizations, everybody comes and tells you or asks you, what should we do to fix the problem? And actually, I think that half of the job consists in saying what should not be done. And this is something, now it's the opportunity for our self-marketing, but we published with Blanca a few weeks ago a paper called 10 Key Principles for PVE Policies at Local Level. And I would say, in order to avoid the main problems that we are faced with in terms of profiling, stigmatization, further exclusion, alienating people because they feel they are monitored by the authorities, I would say, first, maybe connecting more and more research with policy making. We are faced with a phenomenon that is multidimensional, for which you cannot find a unique framework of explanation. So you definitely need to have researchers on there, or to provide research, empirical evidence, so that policymakers can take the appropriate decision. Because what happens if they do not do so? They will rely on their own understanding of what radicalization is, with the consequence that it has. In France, it was merely a religious issue. And until 2 years ago, we had in France centers of de-radicalization, where people were taught the values of our Republic in order to not become extremist anymore. Then I would say defining what is PVE and what is not PVE, I think it's something absolutely key when you prepare or design any PVE program. And then I think there is another problem, and I think this is from where the discussion arose in terms of why should we not put that much money, why do we put so much money on PVE and so on. I think PVE, if you understand what it is, it's a long-run strategy. And the biggest problem that we have is how can you implement a long-run strategy with political leaders who are tasked to do the job in the short run? It's something quite hard. And it's even more hard as you cannot demonstrate that by leading this PVE policy, you avoided a number of terrorist attacks. You cannot establish a relationship between the implementation of a program and the effect. And I think the political cost of this is huge, actually. So, and finally, I would say in terms of actors, you need just to decentralize. And I think the ones who can do the job, not only in terms of counter-narratives and so on, I think there are the actors who are already doing the job in stemming marginalization, in fighting against exclusion, and so on and so forth. And I would say the main thing is not to label this work as being PVE. Because if you do so, and this is what is happening for the past 5 years, any single UN organization who wants to fund a project in Tunisia on culture, they now go to civil society organization and they say, okay, put something about PVE. I want this to be PVE relevant. If it's a project on gender equality, you need to put a line that has to do with PVE. But what's the impact of this for the local populations? They are just seen as a potential terrorist. If there is no gender equality, I may become a terrorist. If I'm excluded, I may become a terrorist. And we actually fall into these explanations that Christian was criticizing just before.
Christian, your last words for this seminar.
So you were at Harvard, so did you have a chance to run into Steven Pinker? Yes. And did you have a chance to read his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature?
I watched his presentation on the book, actually.
So I'm sort of adulterating this. It's a big book. So Steven Pinker is a Canadian. He's a sociobiologist, used to teach at McGill, is now at Harvard. Wrote a fantastic book called Better Angels of Our Nature. He has a fantastic new book called Enlightenment Now. A nice little pun on Apocalypse Now. The basic premise of The Better Angels of Our Nature is sort of we've become desensitized. We've become sensitized, highly sensitized to violence because we've essentially found institutional mechanisms to remove violence from our private and public lives. So issues we would have solved through violence previously, now we have also other ways of solving. And so I think as a society, we've reached a very low threshold of violence that we now find deeply troubling that wouldn't have been troubling decades or even a century ago, right? So if you think about the extent of political violence 100 years ago, that was part and parcel of almost daily life, depending on sort of on where you would have been. And so I think as a result of this high sensitization to violence, and especially to political violence, because of course the social contract in a democracy is we won't resort to violence to advocate our political positions, means that what governments spend in particular on security becomes a sort of insurance policy. It's an insurance policy against people resorting to violence and to a less extent to other sorts of crime. But the problem with the insurance, so it's about how much coverage do you want to buy, and what kind of coverage do you want to buy, and what are you prepared to pay for it. The problem, of course, with it is that what we're trying to measure is non-events. We're trying to measure zeros, because the ones are very, very small and very few. And so when we spend on an insurance policy, it really becomes a democratic decision. You know, you don't know whether your house is going to burn down. So you need to decide what you can live with, right? Governments don't insure when they build stuff because they can bear the risk. As individuals, we can't. If our house burns down, we need to have insurance because we don't have enough money to rebuild it. And I think that's sort of what governments sort of are engaging here. And what the signals that we send is, what is it that we're willing to pay for those zeros that we can't really ultimately measure? But the risk that we've run into is that in the conversation, I think this is also what the questions have sort of indicated, we put a lot of emphasis on the inputs, as we always do in public policy, right? Because that's the stuff that we can measure. We can measure policies, we can measure how much stuff we spend on something, we can measure how many cops we put out on the streets. Whereas I think we need to have much more of a conversation about the outputs and the outcomes. And let's figure out, what is it that we want to achieve in terms of the output? What is it that we want to achieve in terms of the outcome? And I think this is sort of the point about the medium-term strategy. And then let's think about what are the inputs that we can actually link to those, to the effects that we're trying to achieve. And so Moussa has probably a bit more optimism in public policy making than I do, because as researchers, we always like to say we like to provide evidence for public policy. And if you're a Canadian politician, then you like to say we're engaged in evidence-based policy making. But I actually think most politicians are engaged in decision-based evidence seeking. Enough said.
Well, thank you, Christian. Thank you for coming to Barcelona and to CIDOB. Thanks as well to the Canadian Consulate and to Lorraine for having been key in having Christian here. Thanks, Moussa, for being here as well with us and for having organized the seminar. I moltíssimes gràcies a tots vosaltres per haver compartit aquest vespre amb nosaltres. Gràcies. Hemos sido de una puntualidad